Nowadays, Linux is the undisputed kernel and OS king of the free software world. But if you need something a bit more permissive, you have things like the BSD projects like FreeBSD, NetBSD, and OpenBSD. But if you go back to the late 80s and early 90s, this is not the way it was supposed to go. For example, the argument between the Minix creator and Linus Torvalds. At the time, it was assumed that Linux was going to be this temporary thing that Linus used to learn how his 8386 worked, and maybe a couple of people would be interested, but he never expected it to be known the whole world over, because at the time, everybody was excited for GNU's project, GNU Hurd with the GNU mock kernel. GNU Mock and Linux operate in a very different way. Linux is what is known as a monolithic kernel, where all of your low-level components, like your device drivers, your file system, all of that fun stuff, operates in kernel mode. The kernel is this large structure. It is a monolith, whereas GNU Mock, that is known as a microkernel, where the kernel is this very thin layer that sits just above the hardware, and then all of those device drivers, file system, all that fun stuff, that runs in user mode and then interacts with the hardware going through the kernel. The problem with a microkernel is the same problem the Linux kernel has without all of the GNU userland tooling. It doesn't really do anything useful, but in the case of a microkernel like Mock, it does even less because you don't have your device drivers, your file system, or anything else like that. All it is a layer between the hardware and the higher level software. So what GNU Hurd does is it provides all of those low level services to the GNU Mock microkernel. And very recently, Debian GNU Hurd had its 2023 release. So clearly GNU Hurd isn't completely dead. But whatever happened to it? To understand that, we need to go all the way back to the start of the project, back to 1983 when Stallman started the GNU project. The intention of GNU was to create a completely free operating system. Not free as in gratis, free as in beer, free as in Libre. Free as in defined by Richard Stallman and the Free Software Foundation. Speaking of the FSF, they were formed in 1985, and then by 1989, the GNU General Public License was created, or more commonly just called the GNU GPL, or just GPL. Now, by this point, most of what you need for an OS to actually be a usable OS was already heavily in development, or in some cases, basically functionally complete. Bash was started in 1989, GNU Emacs in 1985, GDB in 1986, glibc in 1987, and it wasn't rebranded into the core utils yet. I believe at the time it was called File Utils, but much of that work was already functionally complete. But in 1989, one big component was still missing from the whole operating system puzzle. A kernel. Keep in mind, Linux didn't exist until 1991, but that doesn't mean GNU wasn't working on something. All the way back in 1983 when GNU was first formed, a different kernel was being worked on. This was going to be based on Trix. This is a monolithic kernel coming out of MIT's Laboratory of Computer Science, running on the GNU machine. But this plan ended up being scrapped for a microkernel design. Fun little tidbit, X11 also came out of MIT as well, and so did the MIT license. They were very involved in this space at the time. Now, in 1986, the Trix project was dropped. Not because there was anything inherently wrong with it. They were working on it for 3 years, and it seemed like it was going fairly stably and fairly well. But Stallman started having discussions with a completely separate kernel developer. Not the developer the principal architect of Hurd wanted to work with. So Thomas Bushnell was basically the head guy under Stallman. And he had a different idea. He was very familiar with BSD at the time, and he wanted to base Hurd on BSD 4.4 Lite. Stallman would have been happy to do so, but he wanted to work directly with Berkeley to make it happen, which, makes sense. They're working with MIT before, now he wants to work with Berkeley. And a lot of people at Berkeley were very happy to do so. They were very receptive to this project. But there are a bunch of other people that were dragging their feet, didn't really want to talk about it, and were kind of just like wasting people's time. Now we know why they did that, because at the time, BSDI was being worked on. This was a corporate BSD system that basically would have been completely undermined by GNU Hurd. If you have a completely free system being developed by the exact same people, why would you go and pay for this other system? Even though BSD 4.4 Lite was a stripped-down version of BSD 4.4 Encumbered, it was licensed under the permissive Berkeley license, so if they wanted to, they could have just gone and used it themselves. And since then, Thomas has said, it is now perfectly obvious to me that this would have succeeded splendidly and the world would be a very different place today. But also, it was Stallman's call to make, and he decided to work with Carnegie Mellon University. In 1987, they held discussions with CMU to make use of their mock microkernel design. This was a disastrous mistake, because unlike BSD 4.4 Lite, which was a very stripped-down system, but under a license they could use, mock, which was a much more complete design, didn't have a license they could use, and the project was put on hold for 3 years until they made a decision on how they wanted to license it. Finally, in 1990, GNU Hurd was born, and then by November of 1991, GNU Hurd was running on the mock kernel. This is a problem though, because November is after August, and August is when Linux was first released. But no need to worry, this is just by some kid in university. Even he doesn't think this is going to become some serious project that everybody in the world is using. Torvalds literally just made Linux to learn how his 8386 CPU worked. That is all. It wasn't supposed to be this serious project, he didn't expect anybody to use it. But Linux didn't just exist in a vacuum, because years prior, GNU did all of this work building all of this free operating system tooling. So what if we pair Linux with GNU? All of a sudden, we now have a working operating system. So to put it simply, GNU Hurd was just not ready when Linux came out. If GNU Hurd started in 1987 like they actually wanted to and had 3 extra years of development, without a doubt, GNU Hurd is what we'd all be running today. But that didn't happen. They basically started development right around the time that Linux was getting ready to release. Torvalds had already been working on Linux for quite a while at this point. And really, Linux's only problem was the license. Because, if you don't know, Linux wasn't originally licensed under the GPL. This mess right here is the original Linux license. It is not written by a lawyer, it's not written by someone who even remotely understands law, it's written by Torvalds, who was just writing things that he wanted people to do. This kernel is copyright 1991 Linus Torvalds, but all or part of it may be redistributed, provided you do the following. Full source must be available and free. Fair enough. If not with the distribution, then at least on asking for it. This is basically how the GPL works, but written in a very not legalese way. Copyright notices must be intact. In fact, if you distribute only parts of it, as there aren't copyrights in all files, small partial excerpts may be copied without bothering with copyrights. What does small mean? I don't know. He was just writing things. You may not distribute, he also had a spelling mistake in there, this for a fee, not even handling costs. So you couldn't sell Linux, it had to be completely free. But Torvalds has since stated that he had no idea what he was doing. So that original copyright license was just me writing things up. There was pretty obviously no actual lawyeries or anything there. The 2 important parts were the full source must be available and no money may be involved. The no money part came about because I'd been annoyed with being a rather poor student, having to pay something like 169 USD for Minix, and that had been a fair amount of money to me. I felt that part of the point was to make something available to others in my situation, and that it really should be free in the actual money sense. So for me, free as in gratis was actually an earlier concern than the whole free as in freedom. I still happen to believe that being available even if you're a poor person who doesn't have any money at all is at least as important as anything else, because that's a basic availability issue for many people. A few months into the life of Linux, Torvalds swapped over to the GPL. The reason this happened is someone contacted Torvalds and said, hey, I'm trying to distribute Linux at an event, but it doesn't really make any sense for me to do so because I'm just burning money doing it. Can I charge a very small fee just to recoup the cost and break even? He thought, okay, that's a pretty reasonable idea. Maybe the money point wasn't as big of a deal. And the GPL, while not being a perfect license for Torvalds, did pretty much everything he needed without any of the drawbacks that might come from other licenses, even things like the GPL v3, which Torvalds has specifically said that he doesn't really care about TiVoization. But once this happened, any of the selling point of GNU Hurd basically just went out of the window. Now it doesn't even have a better license. So by 1995, Linux was very clearly gaining a lot of popularity. Distros like Debian and Slackware were already established and, a thing that you could use and were being used in production systems, and by the year 2000, they even had support of IBM, and it was pretty clear that Linux was going to be a massive thing. It was taking over the newly forming internet, and Linux had pretty much won this space. As Linux gained popularity, it gained developers, and as it gained developers, GNU Hurd lost developers. Over time, GNU Hurd basically slowed down to a crawl, and Linux was rocketing ahead way into the future, and there was no way for GNU Hurd to actually catch up with all of these developers that existed on Linux. As we saw from Debian GNU Hurd, the project didn't stop. So in 1994, they stopped using the CMU version of Mock and instead started using the University of Utah's version. Very quickly though, they stopped maintaining it, and GNU ended up taking over Mock themselves. They created GNU Mock. This happened in 1996. And whilst many improvements have been made to GNU Hurd over the years, dealing with bug fixes, dealing with performance improvements, all of this fun stuff, one problem still remained and is probably never going to be fixed: the lack of hardware support, because Linux had all of these major corporations developing drivers and backing the kernel. So even though many of these drivers were not licensed in a way that Stallman would be happy about, they existed, and users liked that they existed and could actually use the devices they owned. And while certain device classes could absolutely be addressed by GNU Hurd, like it's being done with RC Linux with the Apple Silicon chips, when it comes to addressing the wide range of hardware being used nowadays on Linux, and the fact that more hardware is coming out every single day, and basically no one develops GNU Hurd, it's pretty much an impossible task to complete. Even back in 2010, Stallman had mostly given up on the project, saying he's not very optimistic about GNU Hurd. It makes some progress, but to be really superior, it would require solving a lot of deep problems. But also, it's not really crucial for it to be finished, because there's already a free kernel, that being Linux. Nowadays, in 2023, GNU Hurd is mostly usable in a virtual machine, but it's not really suitable for a production environment. So while I said Debian GNU Hurd exists, we're not talking the entirety of Debian. So Debian GNU Hurd is currently available for i386 and can build around 65% of the Debian archive. 64-bit support has improved a lot, but there is still a work in progress. This is not something you're going to be running as a day-to-day system, but it does exist, and it is slowly being worked on, and maybe one day there'll be a boost in development, maybe one day more people will be excited, but right now, it's just sort of a thing that exists there that some people still happen to work on. But if history went a little bit differently, nobody would be using Linux. Instead, we'd all be using GNU Hurd. Now, in case you're curious, Hurd is an acronym. It's actually a recursive acronym. So Hurd stands for Herd of Unix Replacing Daemons, but Hurd spelt with an I. and then Hurd inside of that stands for Hurd of interfaces representing depth. And then it recurses back on itself because recursive acronyms are funny. Also, it's a play on words. GNU, Hurd, it's a herd of GNU. Also, if you want to get more in depth with quotes and things like that, check out this page on Grok Law. It is an absolute excellent read. So let me know. Did you happen to know about GNU Hurd? Were you around when GNU Hurd was actually this exciting thing that everybody thought was gonna be the operating system? I would love to know. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. And if you like the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, Scribe, Slightly Pay linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and GNU away. That was a bad joke.
Like this.